In 1816, a year without a summer, crops failed across 3 continents simultaneously. The official explanation, a volcanic eruption in Indonesia, accounts for the cold. It does not account for what was built during the recovery. Within 15 years of that global disruption, more than 40 cities across Europe, the Americas, and Central Asia installed nearly identical public timekeeping systems, not similar. Identical in proportion, in placement, in the mechanical logic underneath the face. The tolerance range across these installations, separated by oceans and mountain ranges, is less than 3%. That number deserves a moment. 3% variance across 40 cities. Cities that had no telegraph connection to each other. Cities whose languages shared no common root. Cities whose governments were, in several cases, actively at war. And yet, the clocks matched. Before going further, it is worth being clear about what this documentary is and what it is not. This is an examination of architectural and infrastructural patterns across the 19th century. The evidence presented here comes from municipal records, engineering surveys, and historical construction logs. Where interpretation is offered, it will be offered as interpretation. The record speaks first. The standard story of 19th century urban development is a story of independent ingenuity. Cities grew. They needed infrastructure. Engineers, responding to local conditions and local resources, built what their populations required. Clock tower in this telling is simply a practical solution to a practical problem before pocket watches became affordable. A central public timepiece served the same function a smartphone notification serves now. Told people when to start work, when to stop, when the train was leaving. That explanation is reasonable. It is also incomplete, because the pattern that emerges when you map these installations across a 20-year window, 1820 to 1840, is not the pattern of independent problem solving. Independent problem solving produces variation, produces clock towers of different heights, different mechanical systems, different orientations relative to the street grid. What the record actually shows is something closer to replication. Start in Philadelphia. The Merchants Exchange, completed in 1834, includes a clock mechanism installed at a height of 62 feet above street level, with a dial diameter of 8 feet. The gear reduction ratio of the original movement, documented in the builder's invoice, is 1 to 4,320. Moved to Lyon, France. The Hôtel de Ville clock, renovated in the same decade, sits at 60 feet above the plaza. Dial diameter, 7 feet, 10 inches. Gear reduction ratio, 1 to 4,320. Moved to Odessa, in what was then the Russian Empire. The clock installed on the Primorsky Boulevard staircase complex in 1841, 63 feet, 8-foot dial, gear ratio documented in the municipal engineering record as 1 to 4,320. These are not the same clockmaker. The Philadelphia mechanism was produced by a local foundry. The Lyon movement came from a Swiss firm. The Odessa installation was attributed to an artisan working under imperial commission. 3 different makers, 3 different countries, 3 different centuries of local tradition. 1 ratio. The gear reduction of 1 to 4,320 is not a magic number. It is an engineering choice, a specific relationship between the driving weight and the escapement speed that produces 1 complete rotation of the minute hand every 60 minutes, with a particular tolerance for temperature fluctuation and friction loss. It works. It is a good ratio, but it is one of several good ratios available to a 19th century clockmaker. The mathematics support at least a dozen viable configurations, all of which were known to trained engineers of the period. Some were simpler to manufacture. Some required less precise casting. And yet across these 3 cities, and when you extend the search across more than 24 others, the same configuration appears. Not the simplest one, not the cheapest one, the same one. Istanbul. The Tafane clock tower, constructed in 1848, stands at about 60 feet. Its original movement, now preserved in a Turkish engineering museum, shows a gear reduction of 1 to 4,320. Kolkata, clock installed at the Writers' Building complex during British administrative expansion in the 1830s. 61 feet. Documented ratio of 1 to 4,320. Buenos Aires. The Torre de los Ingleses, technically built in 1910, but blueprints submitted to the City Council in 1906 referenced the established municipal standard without specifying whose standard or when it was established. The ratio 1 to 4,320. The geographical spread here is not incidental. Philadelphia and Lyon share an Atlantic cultural connection, however loose. But Odessa and Kolkata, Istanbul and Buenos Aires, these cities were not reading the same engineering journals. They were not corresponding with the same guild networks. The political systems governing them had, in some cases, fought recent wars against each other. And still, there is a detail in the municipal records of several of these cities that deserves attention. In multiple cases, the clock installation is not recorded as a new construction project. It is recorded as a renovation, a restoration. The language varies: renewed, repaired, reinstated. But the implication in each case is that something was already there, something that had fallen into disrepair or been damaged or simply stopped working and was being brought back into service. In Philadelphia, the 1834 record refers to the restoration of the exchange timepiece to its original function. The exchange building itself was new. Construction had begun in 1832. There was no previous exchange building on that site. What exactly was being restored? The timing of these projects, clustering in that narrow window after 1816, after the year the harvest failed, and the world went quiet for a season, that timing raises questions that the construction records themselves do not answer. What they do answer is this. By 1845, a traveler moving from the American East Coast to the Russian Black Sea coast, passing through Western Europe and the Mediterranean, would have encountered public timekeeping systems so consistent in their mechanical logic that the same key, theoretically, might have wound any of them. That is not a metaphor. That is a measurement. And measurements, when they repeat in places that have no business agreeing with each other, tend to point somewhere. Not sufficient for the traffic of 1825. Sufficient for the traffic of 1855. Canal engineering is a conservative discipline. You build for what you know, with a margin for what you expect. The Erie's original lock dimensions, 90 feet long, 15 feet wide, 4 feet of water depth, were calculated to accommodate boats carrying approximately 30 tons of cargo. In 1825, the average commercial vessel using inland waterways in the northeastern United States carried between 8 and 12 tons. The locks were built for boats that did not exist yet. Boats that would not exist in commercial numbers for another 2 decades. The engineers knew this. The construction records show it. And the explanation offered at the time that the commissioners were building for future growth is reasonable as far as it goes. This does not go very far when you look at what was happening simultaneously elsewhere. The Leeds and Liverpool Canal in England had been under intermittent construction since 1770. Its lock dimensions, finalized in a series of engineering revisions between 1816 and 1825, that window again settled at 62 feet by 14 feet 2 inches. The revision documents held in the West Yorkshire Archive cite no specific commercial justification for the 1816 adjustment. The language used is administrative, brought into conformity with the established standard. The established standard in 1816 for a canal system that had been building to its own internal logic for 45 years. What standard? Established by whom? The archive does not say. The revision simply proceeds, the dimensions change, and the canal, like the Erie, completed within a decade, opens with a carrying capacity that exceeds its immediate commercial environment by a factor that will not close until the railway era makes the question academic. Railway gauges are where this pattern becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The standard gauge of 4 feet 8, 5 inches, the distance between the inner faces of the rails, now governs approximately 60% of the world's railway network. Its adoption in the 19th century was not smooth or rational. Twisted, fought over, argued in parliamentary committees and engineering journals for decades. And yet by 1886, when the International Gauge Conference in Bern attempted to formalize the question, they found that the majority of major systems had already, independently, converged on the same number. The Stevenson gauge, as it is called, is said to derive from the tramway spacing of northeastern English coal mines. That explanation is partially true. What it does not explain is why railway builders in India, in Argentina, in Australia, operating under different colonial administrations, advised by different engineering firms, so frequently defaulted to that same spacing when given the choice. Even when local conditions argued for something wider or narrower. The Cape gauge of 3 feet 6 inches used across South Africa and parts of Australia is a genuine variant, but even it appears in the construction records as a deliberate departure from a pre-existing expectation. The engineers who specified it wrote in terms of deviation. They were measuring their distance from something already assumed. Electrical grid frequency is a 20th century problem, but its 19th century antecedents follow the same logic. When alternating current systems began proliferating in the 1880s, the frequency question, how many cycles per second should the current complete, was theoretically open. Nikola Tesla's early demonstrations used 60 Hz. European systems, developed slightly later and under different commercial pressures, largely settled on 50 Hz. Within each region, the convergence was rapid and, in the documentary record, strangely unexplained. Cities that had built their own independent generating stations, serving their own industrial customers, arrived at the same frequency without coordination mechanisms sufficient to produce that result. The engineers explained it as market logic. Once a major city committed to a frequency, neighboring cities followed for interoperability reasons. The explanation works forward from the first adopter. It does not explain why the first adopters, in cities without prior contact, kept making the same choice. Turn to the clocks, because the clocks have a structural dimension that the canals and railways partially obscure. Canals' dimensions are constrained by geography. You can argue that the Erie's locks reflect anticipated boat design, and boat design reflects cargo requirements, and cargo requirements reflect population growth projections that were available to any competent economist of the period. The chain of reasoning is long, but it is traceable. Clock towers' placement is not constrained by geography. You put it where people can see it, where the sightline from the commercial center of the city allows the dial to be read at the maximum useful distance. And when you map the placement of these 19th century installations onto their respective city grids, a detail emerges that the canal argument cannot absorb. In city after city, Philadelphia, Lyon, Odessa, Kolkata, Buenos Aires, the clock tower stands at a specific angular relationship to the primary commercial axis of the city. Not at the center, not at the edge, at a point that maximizes visibility from the largest number of simultaneously occupied positions in the marketplace below. The angle varies slightly by city geography, but the optimization principle is identical. This is sophisticated urban planning. It requires survey data, population flow modeling, and an understanding of how people move through commercial space under working conditions. In the 1830s, that kind of analysis was not routine. It was not the default approach of a municipal engineer responding to a local request for a public clock. It was, however, the approach of someone working from a template. The administrative similarities compound the physical ones. Municipal record-keeping structures in cities as culturally distant as Cincinnati and Krakow show, in the 1820s and 1830s, a parallel shift towards standardized infrastructure documentation. The forms change. The categories of information recorded change. The level of dimensional specificity required before a public works project could be approved changes upward toward precision in multiple cities in the same decade, with no documented communication between the relevant administrative bodies. Cincinnati, the 1831 revision to the city's public works ordinance, required that all clock and bell installations submit dimensional drawings to 3 decimal places of precision. Previous standard had required whole numbers. In Krakow, under Austrian administration at the time, an 1829 imperial directive required the same precision level for all public timekeeping infrastructure, 3 decimal places. Whether this reflects inheritance from a common administrative tradition or convergence toward a shared engineering logic, or something that does not fit comfortably into either of those categories, the record does not resolve cleanly. What it does is accumulate. Detail by detail, city by city, canal lock by clock tower by railway tie. The picture that forms is of infrastructure arriving into a world that seems, in some quiet and measurable way, to have been prepared to receive it. The preparation has a name that people have started using online. The name is older than the internet by several centuries, and understanding what it actually referred to before it became a label for everything that does not fit is where this goes next. It was a label for the unknown. Not a kingdom, not a government. A cartographic placeholder. What happened to that word in the 21st century is a separate story, and it begins not with historians but with image searches. Somewhere around 2017, a cluster of posts began circulating on alternative history forums. Reddit threads, Telegram channels, YouTube comment sections, pointing to 19th century photographs of large public buildings in American and European cities. The buildings were ornate. They had domed roofs, arch windows, elaborate stonework, and the posts argued, with mounting enthusiasm, that these buildings were too sophisticated, too consistent in style, and too numerous to have been built by the populations that history credited with building them. The argument evolved quickly. Within 2 years, it had absorbed the clock tower data, the canal dimensions, the railway gauge questions, and a significant amount of genuine architectural history, mixed with a significant amount of speculation. The label attached to the proposed lost civilization responsible for all of it was borrowed from those old European maps. Tartaria, word that had meant nothing more than here be unknowns, became, in online circulation, the name of an empire that supposedly spanned the globe, built everything, and was erased from the record sometime in the 19th century. The irony is that the original cartographic Tartaria was itself a record of absence. It marked what Europeans did not know. Its modern reincarnation marks what some people feel is not being explained. In both cases, the word is doing the same work. It is holding space for a gap. There are, broadly, 3 ways to interpret the pattern this documentary has been tracing. They are not equally popular, but they are each internally coherent, and none of them requires dishonesty to maintain. The first interpretation is the one that academic history offers, and it deserves more credit than the online discourse typically gives it. The 19th century was a period of unprecedented information transfer. Engineering knowledge moved through professional networks, journals, apprenticeships, international exhibitions, colonial administrative structures, at a speed that the popular imagination consistently underestimates. The Great Exhibition of 1851 in London brought engineers and architects from dozens of countries into direct contact with each other's work. Similar exhibitions in Paris, Vienna, and Philadelphia followed. Clockmaker in Odessa, who attended the 1851 exhibition, or who read the published proceedings, had access to the same technical specifications as a clockmaker in Philadelphia. The gear ratio of 1 to 4,320 may have spread not because it was inherited from a prior civilization, but because it was published, demonstrated, and adopted by a professional community that was more globally connected than the absence of digital communication might suggest. The canal dimensions in this reading reflect the rational projections of engineers who were corresponding with each other, reading each other's reports, and making similar calculations from similar economic data. The administrative standardization reflects the spread of Enlightenment bureaucratic models through colonial and diplomatic channels. Everything converges because everything was, in fact, connected just through mechanisms that left lighter traces in the popular record than we might expect. This interpretation is not dismissive. It is the product of serious historical work, and it explains the majority of the evidence without remainder. The second interpretation takes the same evidence and reads it through a different lens. It does not require a hidden empire or an erased civilization. It requires only that the timeline of certain technologies be slightly different from what the standard account assumes. Institutional memory is longer than individual memory. Guild tradition, a religious order, an administrative body with continuous existence across centuries can carry technical knowledge forward in ways that leave almost no documentary trace, because the knowledge is transmitted through practice, not through writing. The Roman Catholic Church administered hospitals in Europe for over 1,000 years, using medical practices that were not fully documented until the 19th century, when physicians began systematically recording what the monastic communities had been doing all along. If analogous bodies, engineering guilds, merchant organizations, administrative orders operating across national boundaries, carried infrastructure standards forward from an earlier period of technical sophistication, the 19th century convergence would look exactly as it does, not like a conspiracy, like a tradition surfacing. The standards would appear without clear origin because their origin was oral, practical, and institutional rather than written and archival. This interpretation does not name Tartaria. It names something older and less dramatic: the persistence of technical tradition through institutional continuity. The third interpretation is the one that the online discourse has popularized, and stating it clearly is more useful than dismissing it. It holds that a civilization of significant technical sophistication preceded the one recorded in 19th century history, that this civilization built or established the infrastructure templates now attributed to independent local ingenuity, and that its existence was either deliberately obscured or simply lost in a catastrophic disruption. The year without a summer appears in this reading not as context but as consequence. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, and the climatic disruption that followed, is, in this interpretation, the terminal event, or one of several, that broke the continuity of a prior order. What was built afterward, in that narrow window of 1820 to 1840, was built by people working from fragments, inheriting proportions they no longer fully understood, installing gear ratios that had been handed to them without the theoretical framework that originally generated them. The evidence this interpretation relies on is the same evidence the other two interpretations address. The difference is not in the data. It is in what kind of gap the interpreter is willing to tolerate in the causal chain. Turn to 1816, because 1816 is where the texture of the question lives. In the spring of that year, farmers in New England planted their crops in the usual window. In June, frost killed them. They planted again. Frost came again in July. The summer of 1816 produced temperatures in parts of Europe and North America that had not been recorded since instrument-based meteorology began. Rivers ran cold through August. The harvest across 3 continents failed in the same season. And then, beginning almost immediately, within 5 years, in some cases within 2, the building started. The canals, the railways, clock towers with their matched ratios and their precisely optimized sightlines, the administrative standardization, the infrastructure that arrived in city after city, already knowing what it was supposed to be. The metaphor that clarifies this is not discovery. It is not invention. The metaphor that fits the pattern is the one you reach for when you find a path through a forest that is clearly worn but shows no signs of recent use. Someone walked here before. The trees have grown back around the edges, but the line of the path is still there, still direct, still leading somewhere. The path does not tell you who made it. It tells you that someone knew where they were going.